Welcome to IJ4EU Confidential, where we take you behind the scenes of groundbreaking investigative journalism. I'm Timothy Large.
And I'm Melissa Miletic.
And we're both from the International Press Institute in Vienna, where we manage the Investigative Journalism for Europe program, supporting cross-border watchdog journalism as a public good. Now, if you joined us last time on IJ4EU Confidential, we were talking about dirty gold. How gold mined illegally in the Brazilian Amazon ends up in electronics and jewelry in Europe, with dire consequences for the rainforest and indigenous people. It was pretty eye-opening stuff, wasn't it, Melissa?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was. We had a good conversation. We learned a lot. And as a result of that conversation, I don't think I'll be able to look at a gold ring or a pair of earrings the same way again, or those cute proposal videos on YouTube. So thank you, IJ4EU, for ruining the romance. And today we expect another good conversation. We have a live audience again. So once again, please feel free to take part, post your questions in the chat.
Now, today's IJ4EU Confidential takes us a little closer to home, this time to Ukraine. Of course, it's been almost 2.5 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It's been a brutal conflict, I don't need to tell you. Tens of thousands killed, cities devastated, and the war grinds on, with both sides thoroughly dug in. And in some ways, the scenes from the battlefield are reminiscent of the kind of trench warfare of World War I. But in other ways, this is a thoroughly modern war, with the latest high-tech arms, not least drones. In fact, the use of drones in Ukraine is utterly unprecedented anywhere in the world. These unmanned aerial vehicles are used from everything from spying on enemy positions to guiding artillery to dropping bombs on targets. And today, we discuss an award-winning investigation with disturbing revelations about Russia's use of drones in Ukraine. It's disturbing in the way the drones are deployed, but also in who provides the technology and the components and so on that makes them. I think you'll be surprised when you find out who's behind some of that.
The investigation is called Russia's War, Europe's Burden. It was done as a collaboration between a German magazine, Der Spiegel, and Air Wars. Air Wars is a UK-based transparency watchdog, and they're specialized in monitoring how wars affect civilians. The whole project was coordinated and led by a Danish freelancer, Nikolai Homan. Unfortunately, Nikolai is not with us today, but fortunately, today we have Sanjana Varghese, formerly with Air Wars, and recently she joined the New York Times. Welcome, Sanjana. And at the very beginning, tell us a little about yourself.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, and it's such a pleasure to be here today to talk about this investigation. So I'm Sanjana. I was formerly an investigator at the Air Wars Investigations Unit, so focusing mostly on conflict. Prior to that, I did a master's in forensic architecture at the University of Goldsmiths, and I was a freelance journalist before that. I've recently joined the Visual Investigations Unit at the New York Times. I joined in May, but I'm really excited to talk to you about this project, which is one of the kind of last major ones I did collaboratively before I left Air Wars. So thanks for having me.
Well, thanks so much for being on the program today. Before we get to your findings, Sanjana, I wonder if you could just give us a general sense of the impact that drones are having both on and off the battlefield in Ukraine. I mean, when speaking about drone warfare, we often hear that word unprecedented. I used it just a minute ago. But what does that really mean? What's the scale of the drone use? How are drones changing warfare? Paint us a picture.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm very happy to. I'll preface by saying, obviously, like, while we spent so much time looking at this landscape, it's so crowded and so complicated that I'm by no means like a subject matter expert. There are plenty of people who are, but I can try and give I can paint a little bit of a picture. So my impression really, I think, particularly from doing this investigation, is that drone warfare really is changing not just battlefields in Ukraine, although I think it's obviously a very kind of exemplary case of that trend, but actually it's changing battlefields more generally. I think drones and UAVs have become, orders of magnitude so much more accessible, not just for militaries, which I think has been the traditional kind of actor that would use these UAVs, particularly because of the technology and like the kind of economic risk associated with developing them. But really you're seeing now that non-state actors, armed groups, militias, paramilitary, are really being able to use these drones in ways that a formalized military might not actually be able to. And now you see formalized militaries are actually playing catch up a little bit. And I think a big reason for this, and something that we obviously really touched on in our investigation, is that, civilian components and civilian drones are actually now being used in a range of scenarios. So while typically kind of these drones were maybe used for like reconnaissance, they're kind of aerial surveillance, we're really seeing that there's a lot of modification that's going on to make them actually, be able to be used as armed drones. And that's a very fascinating development, obviously with very deadly consequences. I think there's so many other changes that we can't even really get into, and it's such a crowded field. But I think the other kind of thing that really sticks out about this trend is that there's a greater proliferation of private actors. So actors that make, produce military drones alongside commercial drones, or inadvertently or deliberately. And that leads to some thornier questions about, attribution, responsibility for civilian harm, kind of battlefield effects, and then so on. So that's a little bit of the picture, but I think there's, so much more to get into, and maybe we'll get into it in the next hour.
Absolutely. And of course, if people have questions, put them in the chat and we will get to them as soon as we can. Right, let's get to your findings. So this is an investigation which, in a way, I think it had two main areas of focus. One had to do with Russia's use of drones designed and or made in Iran, which is very interesting. We'll come back to that in just a second. But the first part of the investigation, published by Der Spiegel and Air Wars, looked at the sale of components to a key supplier of Russian drones, and those drones are known as Orlan-10. And Russia's used a lot of these Orlan-10 drones in Ukraine. Who did you find was supplying the components, and presumably it surprised you when you found out who it was?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There are kind of two components to this kind of series of investigation. I think the first part of the investigation, as you pointed out, does really focus on these specific components that we found were actually shipped or seem to have been shipped by a lot of German companies.
German
to a
companies.
key supplier. Yeah, German companies, European companies, to a key supplier of Orlan-10 drones. And Orlan-10 drones, I think, just for some context, are a drone that's being really extensively used still by the Russian military in Ukraine. They can be aerial surveillance drones, but they're also increasingly kind of armed iterations that are being used by Russian forces. And so many of the companies that we found, in trade data were companies like Infineon, Worth, AMS, Odrem, companies which actually produce so many different kinds of electrical components that it's very difficult actually for even people who are really involved in this from the company side to track where those components are going. So what we really found was that there was a company called SNPI Logic, which is kind of a key supplier of the parts for these drones. They were sanctioned in 2016 by the US and then sanctioned again by the EU in 2023. But they're able to still ship these components from companies like the German companies mentioned earlier. And this happens for a lot of different reasons. I think it's very easy to think that it's like a straight one-to-one relation, but actually the nature of the component-related marketplace is so diffuse. And this is something we really found when we were investigating it. It presents a lot of challenges as a journalist too, is that good, that are produced by these companies are often actually made somewhere else. And then they're kind of routed through these intermediary hubs, transshipment kind of hubs, through places like Hong Kong, mainland China, many other places to actually arrive at their end destination. And so we actually use primarily trade data as well as, kind of speaking to sources and interviewing experts to kind of substantiate these findings. We dug into these really complex databases and information dump, basically a lot of big spreadsheets to track specific components. So we were tracking, a particular kind of sensor, a particular kind of LED that we knew was being used by Russian forces in this particular way as part of the Orlan-10 drone. We also found that manufacturers, like the companies mentioned earlier, rarely, if ever, actually, I'm not entirely sure, actually directly exported product from, Germany straight to Russia, or from this company straight to somewhere else. It was kind of through a range of other firms and actors, all of which is very murky and complex. And the one thing I'll actually add is that tracking this stuff was so difficult even for companies. And the components that we're talking about are kind of dual use. They can be used in so many different ways in fridges and lawnmowers, all kinds of things. And so it's a real moving goalpost. So even if for us as journalists who are focused on this, but also I think for people who are involved in like sanctions enforcement or work for these companies, it changes almost like week to week, day to day. And I think that presents a real challenge when you're trying to crack down on this stuff. And that was something we really saw after the publication of this report as well.
So let me just clarify. I mean, it seems quite shocking that you have EU-based companies providing, despite sanctions, providing components to Russia for use in in Ukraine. Because the supply chains are just so complex that this almost happens by accident, or is this a very deliberate kind of, all right, we're going to circumvent sanctions and supply Russia despite them finding routes to do that? In other words, how angry should we be at these companies?
I think it's always tricky to infer intention from stuff like this. I mean, these are the data that we use and the sources we spoke to primarily, it's secondary data. So in no case did we ever go to Infineon and get right into the heart of what they were doing. We weren't able to access that information for various, I think, perfectly legitimate reasons. I think it's a combination of a couple of different things. So I think something we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a bit, like the impact of the investigation. You see that there are individuals who have every incentive and reason, whether it's political or financial or whatever, combination of all of the above, to really directly kind of navigate these sanctions. And that can be for a lot of reasons. What we do often find, though, is that companies that produce these components really have no idea about this. And they're, as much as we're trying to track and understand this, they're also kind of going after the same thing. And so I think that there's a kind of certain element of cat and mouse that you enter into when you're looking at this. I think in terms of, actually how deliberate this is, I think there are individuals, again, who are very kind of keen and very kind of focused and have set up very complex networks to facilitate the movement of these components to get to places like SMTI logic. I think when it comes to maybe bigger institutional actors, the kind of companies themselves, I think there's a range of other factors at play that I probably wouldn't comment on.
Can you
question? Oh, sorry. Well, go ahead. Then we'll get to the question. Sorry.
I'm just curious, with all the findings that you managed to get, can you tell us a bit about the impact? Was anyone held to account?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to measure the impact of investigations like the, you often don't really get to see the immediate impact of it. It take time, just as the reporting takes time. But 3 months after the article was published, I think 3 of the companies that we highlighted were subject to sanctions imposed by the US. I think around August of that year, so 2023, as well. The director of industrial components, which is one of the companies that we mentioned, was arrested by German authorities for supplying parts to the Russian military. Again, I'm not entirely sure whether these arrests and these sanctions, have a one-to-one impact on the number of components that are moving in this way. But I think it's certainly a good step forward, and I think it can be a little bit of a deterrent as well.
We have a question from a viewer, Ariane, who asks, where did you find these databases? Are they export registered?
That's such a good question. The only thing I can say is that they are, there's companies like Export Genius and Port Genius, kind of companies like that really have this data that is available on a subscription basis. So you have to pay money for it, essentially. A lot of these places will do cheaper subscriptions if you work for an NGO or are affiliated with an institution. I can't speak on the specifics of that because I actually don't entirely remember. The UN also has some databases about the movement of goods, I think in a very similar kind of level of detail, but obviously doesn't really include specific corporations. But it might be helpful to narrow down, if you're looking at some of this stuff.
Right. Okay, let's get to the second part of the investigation. This one was published by the Financial Times and Airwars, and this examined Russia's covert collaboration with Iran in establishing a facility to manufacture Iranian-designed so-called Kamikaze drones on Russian soil. I mean, that's quite a lot to take in there. What on earth is going on? We got Iranian-designed Kamikaze drones being built on Russian soil through a covert collaboration. That's quite a finding.
It is, and I think it was really great that we were able to do it with the Financial Times, who have so many wonderful journalists who are really knowledgeable about this stuff in a way that I'm not. And so it's really great to work together with them on that as well. So the second part of the investigation was a really interesting step forward. So I think it was about establishing a totally different pattern to what we've seen before. So we were looking at this factory in Turkestan and Yelabuga, which is in the east of Russia, to manufacture what seemed to be Shahed series drones. So different drones from what we were talking about before. I think people are familiar with the kind of shape and the sound of these drones. And we know that these drones were primarily assembled in Iran initially and kind of were designed by, it seems like the IRGC, but then really used to great effect by Russian forces in Ukraine from September 2022 onward. And so there's a real uptick in interest in these drones from the Russian military and I guess from the Russian government more generally. And I think the story is a really fascinating insight into the way that these drones can be manufactured and offshored. And I think, again, linking back to something you were saying earlier about, what is the drone landscape these days, I think it's a very interesting example of how this kind of collaboration or this kind of work or this kind of process probably wouldn't have happened so many years ago between two countries like Russia and Iran in the same way as we now are seeing it happening. So this investigation is actually primarily led by my wonderful colleague Nikolai, who can't be here today. But together, the two of us, and him primarily, really spent hours and hours digging into these very niche forums that only residents in this part of Russia use, and looking for recruiting boards and kind of things like this to kind of piece together what was happening in this facility. So this facility was initially, if I remember correctly, operated by this company Albatross, which has significant links to the Russian Defense Ministry. And so the full article really gets into the detail. I'm not sure I'll do a good job like trying to work through it verbally. But you kind of put these pieces together, so you see that there are these job ads for Farsi speaking kind of Russian engineers in this area. And you kind of get some information from organizations like the Institute for Science and International Security, who did some reporting on this before we did, along with some kind of information from sources, along with open source imagery, so satellite images and things like that, and kind of arrive at our eventual conclusion, which is that this facility was really being used to begin. And I think actually have already now sent off some Shahed to be used by the Russian military. And there's some interesting differences in series numbers that helped us kind of later, substantiate that as well. And so we arrived at our eventual conclusion, which is that Russian drone capacities and capabilities are being boosted by this collaboration, which I think is a very unique kind of process that we haven't really seen in other places before.
Once again, I have to ask about the impact, because those are powerful stories and the finding, and not only impact, but also the effect it had on your sources. What about that? Did you get any feedback from the sources, maybe from military? Did you make any powerful enemies?
If we made any powerful enemies or not, I thankfully haven't found out yet. But we found that this story really garnered a lot of attention and interest from within kind of the niche that we operate in when we were reporting this story, which is kind of people who are really fascinated by, I think, both like Russian-Iranian military relations, as well as people who are really interested in this growing field of kind of kamikaze or one-way attack drone. So there's a lot of really interesting discussions about what this kind of facility actually means in the context of this war in Ukraine, whether it's a model that could be replicated elsewhere by other actors. So that was a really fascinating thing for us to enter into, because it kind of almost, that kind of conversation almost operates that are removed from what Air Wars typically does. So that was really interesting. Some of our sources, I think, obviously, generally we don't really go back to them for feedback. That would be a bit of a weird thing to do. But I know that we got some interest from other people who then spoke to us for our final story, which I think we'll talk about soon, kind of who saw that we were kind of serious about this line of inquiry. And also, I mean, this is something that isn't really impact, but it's kind of a good thing to have in mind is Rula Khalaf, who's the editor of Financial Times, actually called it a must read, which is a really nice endorsement of the work. And I think when you're combining the methods that we use, which is a little bit more like open source, experimental, along with very traditional newspaper reporting, to have that kind of endorsement is like a good step forward, and I think shows we're on the right track. That was really helpful.
Brilliant. Okay, let's get to the third part that you just mentioned there. And just as a way into that, let me just play a very short clip. It's like 2 or 3 seconds only. You mentioned earlier the sound and the shape of these kamikaze Iranian drones, Shahed drones. This is what it looks like. I don't even know if you can see that. What it looks like and what it sounds like. And that little tiny clip comes from the third part of the investigation, which was published by Air Wars, Turkish Spiegel, and Danish newspaper, Information it's called. And this piece, A Year of the Shahed, it was called, is a so-called immersive exploration of the role of these suicide drones in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I'm just going to play a little bit more of, if I can. Whoops, sorry, that's the wrong thing. Just wanted to kind of give viewers a sense of what this multimedia looks like. It's a remarkable piece of multimedia. Takes us up close and personal with these machines of death. You've heard the noise of the drone. It sounds a bit like a lawnmower engine. You've seen this shape of it in an infographic. There's many more such things in this piece. We can hear the voices of civilians in the terrifying landscape where the drones are deployed. It's a really powerful combination of text, graphics, audio, photos, interactive maps, and so on. And of course, it won an award recently. In March, it won a prestigious Sigma Award for excellence in data journalism. And I believe Air Wars' investigative work has been nominated 3 times for Amnesty Media Awards. So congratulations, first of all, for all those accolades. But how did you put together this really remarkable piece of multimedia, which at the end we'll give a link so people can have a look at it themselves? Tell us a little bit about that process, because it's really impactful work.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, it was thanks very much, I think, for the nice words about it. And it was a big list to put it all together. I think obviously this kind of work takes so much time and effort, and really being able to focus on it without other things getting in the way was very, very useful. And I think was really facilitated by the grant that we got. So while we were working on this series, we really realized that there's this big data set, which is sitting kind of, I don't want to say untouched, but was, we weren't really seeing a lot of use of it. So the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is putting out these daily telegram numbers on the updates on the numbers of Shahed series drones that were either launched, or I think sometimes including how many were intercepted by Ukrainian air defenses. And we kind of realized there's so much you can do with that data. And that's really the map that I think briefly flashed up on screen really comes from that. And so our wonderful Ukrainian researchers at Air Wars, particularly our researcher Irina, and I and a couple of other people, we were really instrumental kind of in combining this data set with a lot of other verifications. So we looked at local media reporting, we looked at local reports of where like debris from interception was falling. We looked at a lot of other kind of secondhand verification, as well as visual evidence to make sure that we're getting the numbers right. And so that was kind of like the corner piece, or the centerpiece of our investigation, was that big data set. But we really wanted to lean into an element of these drones that I found was really fascinating, and I think was very under discussed, really, even though there was so much interest in the Shahed, is that you actually see them before you hear them, which I think is like a really terrifying thing if you're a civilian. I have an interest in like sound more generally as well, like more outside of this investigation. And so what we found is that in so much of the footage that you would see, which is kind of on Telegram and X and, even in news footage, you could kind of hear this very distinctive, the sound that we played. And so we kind of ripped that sound from some open source footage that we found, and we incorporated a lot of the visual material that we found, kind of get the investigation, the multimedia investigation that you see now. And I think there's kind of design elements and there's visual elements, if you think the multimedia piece, really, I think, brought home why this drone has proliferated so much in this very crowded landscape. Obviously, I think if you read the article, you see there's a lot about the costing and like, why these drones are really proliferated in a way that I won't get into very detailed. But basically, it's just because, the cost of using these is so little compared to what a traditional military can use. And you can launch them in volleys, and you can launch them in lots of multiple directions. And they're only designed to be used once, right? They're designed to explode. And so I think that adds a very specific element into this landscape. And I think for civilians and really trying to understand how it was to be a Ukrainian living in Ukraine, hearing the sounds, seeing these shapes, I think was very important to us, alongside some of the more kind of policy-oriented analysis that we were able to kind of speak to experts about. And it's a very, it was a big list, as I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of very detail-oriented investigative reporting and design. And it was a really big team that ended up producing the final project. So there's Oliver from Spiegel, and then Nikolai, and then a couple of people from Air Wars' side, including our wonderful visual designers, Julian Azul, Irina, our Ukrainian researcher. And there are so many other people who like touched the piece in some way, including our editors, Joe, who worked at Air Wars. And to get it into the final shape, I think was very important. But there was a lot of back and forth about making sure we had the right balance of visual and kind of multimedia elements, as well as analysis and text. And I think we struck the right balance at the end. But it was really important to make sure that as people were reading it, they were also able to kind of, I don't want to say experience it at all, but I think we're able to see what they were kind of reading about. And I think that was quite an important part of the piece.
It's really impressive. It's really quite something, and terrifying, as you say. Now, I think we're going to try to wrap this up fairly soon. We won't stretch on as long as some of the other ones we've done in the past. So this is a great opportunity to ask questions, everybody, if you have any, before we let Sanjana go. But while you're thinking of any questions or typing them in the chat, let me ask you, Sanjana, if you take these 3 parts of the investigation together and look back at your time doing this project, what was the hardest thing about it? What was the biggest challenge you faced?
In overall?
Overall.
Yeah. I think there were a couple of different things that I can get into, some of which I think were resolved by the end. But I think one was that when we were looking at these drones, not only was it a crowded field in terms of like there's so much stuff you can look at, but also, there's a lot of interest from other media outlets and a lot of interest from researchers and think tanks and other people who also really wanted to understand what we were looking at. And so I think when you work as a journalist, obviously you want to be the first to the story, and that's not always possible. And so I think one of the reasons that we ended up doing the story that we did with the Shahed, the final part that we did, is because we were like, okay, well, we can't compete on time. We can't compete on newsworthiness with a lot of other outlets, because Air Wars, there was like 4 of us, I think, and not even all of us didn't work full time. Nikolai's a freelancer. Obviously, Ollie and Alex at Spiegel had so much other stuff that they were dealing with as well, daily news. So we kind of took a step back and kind of assessed it from like a broader standpoint. And so the challenge that we initially faced was, the newsworthiness, making sure people were still interested in what we had to say. I think we were able to deal with that by the end. I think some of the other challenges are also just making sure that, like, you're not replicating other people's reporting. You're making sure that you're not, like, reporting on something that other people have already done. You're kind of unnecessarily clouding the landscape and in trying to understand this. I think, as well as making sure that you're doing a good job to reflect the lived reality and the experiences of people who are having to deal with this. It's not just a really beautifully designed multimedia piece then lives online. It's also important to make sure that we're being sensitive and careful when speaking to people who have to deal with this. And I think a big design element, for example, is that if you go on the article, you actually don't listen to it automatically. You have to like opt into listening to it. And we were thinking, okay, well, if people want to share this in Ukraine, we don't want them to have to hear this again. Things like that, I think, which was really important. It was a challenge in carrying this out, but I think we struck the right balance by the end.
Is there anything you would do differently now if you had to do it all over again? Unfortunately, war is still on.
Yeah.
And any big lessons learned from this big project?
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, there's so many, and I think it's now been almost a year since we did the bulk of the reporting. So I'm sure some of them I've lost to the memory of the sands of time. But I think big lessons, particularly around this story, is that it's really important to make sure that when you're reporting on things that are so detail oriented, like the sale of component, I think we did strike the right balance at the end, but you have to be so aware of what the reader does and doesn't know. I think when you're doing work on really technical things, and so something that, it comes up for many different journalists of many different kind of times, you have to be really kind of starting from the basics of like, what is a Shahed drone, and like, what is an LED, and like, who cares, basically. And I think that question of like, why does it matter that we're reporting on this, is like something that we really, while we were reporting, really have to remind ourselves, okay, well, this matters because it feeds into this, and reporting on the components matters because it's a very under-discussed element of, this kind of contemporary drone proliferation. And so that kind of balance of making sure that it's accessible, you weren't dumbing it down, but also that you were empathizing why it was an important story to tell. I think that was like something that we did strike the right balance. But I think moving forward, if we were to do more stories on it, I, in my current role, or any of the other journalists on it, I think it's something we'd maybe foreground a little bit more initially. And I think in terms of big lessons as well, I think you have to, again, I've mentioned this already, but in terms of making sure that it's not just an abstract thing of like, there are drones and they're out there and, it's scary or sad or it's interesting. It's like, well, there are people that it really affects. The making sure that experience is brought in is something that I would say is a big lesson.
We have a question from Maria. What's the next project you're planning, and how are you going to choose it?
So as I mentioned earlier, I now work at the New York Times on the visual investigations unit. And so I joined 2 months ago, and I can say safely that I don't know what the next project I'm planning to do is and how I'm going to choose it. Some of those decisions just aren't in my pay grade. But I will say that I think from like speaking to Nikolai and Joe and kind of the other people who work on this area, I think there's a continued interest in looking at, again, the effects of conflict on civilians and on ordinary people. I think drones are kind of an interesting example of this, or this project is an interesting example of understanding that, because I think there's a very clear relationship between how conflict affects civilians in this case, or how conflict affects people in this case. But I think that it's as these wars grind on and kind of either get entrenched or kind of continue on in different ways, I think you see that the kinds of stories that you can tell or that it's important to tell often do change as well. And so I know at Air Wars, that's something they're really thinking about. In my role at the Times, it's something I'm really thinking about as well. Unfortunately, it's not a very specific answer, but I think it depends on what happens in the next couple of weeks and months, and again, where you add value, really.
We have another question from Mirjana. To what extent the non-state actors use drones in Ukraine and Russia? Are non-state actors using them?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think it depends on how you say use. So, for example, it's kind of very well documented that the IRGC in Iran are obviously kind of the originator of the Shahed series drones. The IRGC are a state-armed actor, but there are a lot of rebel groups that have also then bought this technology, and I think bought, if I'm not mistaken, don't quote me on this, but bought like blueprints and kind of the ability to make this technology from state actors. And so I'm not sure that there are a lot of non-state armed actors who are even in Ukraine and Russia at the moment. I think it's also very difficult to identify whether that's happening because the primary conflict that we're, then as a journalist you're looking at, and for me as someone, thousands of miles away I'm looking at, is the one that's happening between two state armed actors. That being said, obviously, I think that because there's been so much innovation and change in how these drones are designed and how they've proliferated, I absolutely would not be surprised to see that non-state armed actors are even in Ukraine and Russia, and I think I'd be more surprised if they weren't. I guess it depends on to what extent that's possible or feasible when so much of the kind of production capacity and interest in this maybe is going towards the side of both militaries. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of a take on it.
That's great. We're getting some praise here from Maria, who thanks you for your wonderful work. I'm sure others would echo that. So thank you so much, Sanjana. It's been a fascinating discussion. We encourage everybody to look at not only the Year of the Shahed, that award-winning article on the Air Wars site and other sites, but the whole body of this work, which you can see on the IJ4EU site, ij4eu.net. And with that, the only other thing I'd like to do is just tell you that next month on August the 16th?
August 16.
Right. We have our next IJ4EU Confidential. This is called Can Journalists Stop a Ticking Climate Bomb? And this is about an investigation called Diffusing a Russian Carbon Bomb. Absolutely fascinating stuff. We'll be joined by Frederick Obermeyer, Sophia Baumann, and Louis Goddard, three incredible journalists who will talk about that project a month from now. So we hope you'll join us for that. In the meantime, thank you so much. Best of luck with your new job at the New York Times. And thanks to all our guests who joined us today. So see you next time on IJ4EU Confidential.
Thanks so much for having me.